The history of aviation is full of tales of shady backroom deals and dodgy characters doing things in odd places. Some of it is now well known and has even played a part in creating US law. Yes, I'm talking about you, Lockheed. And some of it has been, well, let's just say, allegations remain allegations. But it isn't just bribery and corruption that drives these back channel deals. Sometimes people just really need aircraft that they can't otherwise get. And the subject of today's video is a great example of this, the Bellanca 28 series. To start this story of intrigue, we have to begin with an Irish airman by the name of James Fitz Morris, who is a story in his own right. Born in Ireland in 1898, Fitzmaurice enlisted with the British Army as a private in 1915, was wounded in action, and ultimately ended up achieving a commission and transferring to the brand new Royal Air Force in 1918. He stayed with the RAF until 1922 and then moved to the Air Service of the Irish National Army of the newly established Irish Free State, and by 1927 was commander of the Irish Air Corps. In 1928, he was co-pilot on the first successful east-west non-stop flight across the Atlantic. Obviously, breaking aviation records was now Fitzmaurice's primary goal, and after resigning his command in 1929, he began looking for opportunities. And he settled on the biggest air race of the day, the McRobertson Trophy Air Race between London and Melbourne, Australia, scheduled to run in October 1934. While the race offered several prizes, the main one, obviously, was the aircraft that did the specified course in the quickest time. This is what Fitzmaurice aimed for, and in 1934 the best place to get a cutting-edge, long-range, fast aircraft was the United States. At first, Fitzmaurice approached the bigger companies of Lockheed and Northrop, both at the leading edge of aeronautics of the day, but ultimately he settled for the much less well-known Bellanca Aircraft Company. Bellanca is another one of those figures that today really doesn't get the commemoration he deserves, essentially designing aircraft at the cutting edge of their day from 1913 onwards. Bellanca should be remembered as the designer whose aircraft was the first to make the first solo non-stop Atlantic crossing. In 1926 he built the WB-2 Columbia, an aircraft that not only had better range than the famed Spirit of St. Louis, but could do this with a passenger. And the Columbia was the preferred aircraft of Charles Lindbergh, who had a check cut and was all ready to go with the aircraft when a dispute with the machine's owner led to him going off and buying the Spirit for his record-breaking solo flight instead. Indeed, even after that, it seemed that the Columbia would be the first aircraft to make the solo transatlantic flight first, as it was sitting at the same field as the Spirit, all set to take off at the same time. And then a legal dispute delayed the flight, allowing Lindbergh and the Spirit to be first. As it was, the WB-2 made the first ever transatlantic flight to carry a passenger in June 1927, though as the passenger insisted in taking the controls for part of the trip and almost crashed the aircraft, his description as passenger might be pushing it. In 1931, a Bellanca aircraft did set a remarkable record with the first non-stop flight across the Pacific between Japan and the continental United States. I won't go into details here, but that's a flight that quite honestly sounds far more deserving of attention than Lindbergh's. Regardless, the fact is that in the 1930s, Bellanca was still one of the foremost aircraft designers around, even having been featured on the cover of Time magazine, and he offered to build Fitzmaurice an aircraft to compete in the London to Melbourne race in short order for the price of $30,000. This had the Bellanca Company designation of 2870 because it had a wing area of 280 square feet and was powered by a Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp Junior engine that produced 700 horsepower. Fitzmaurice christened it the Irish Swoop. The 2870 was a low-wing monoplane built from a steel tube superstructure skinned in fabric and aluminium, with a retractable undercarriage and which carried a two-man crew in a long greenhouse style of cockpit. With a top speed of 275 miles per hour and a range of 2,500 miles, the aircraft's performance was certainly impressive. However, as the race was to start in October 1934, things were somewhat rushed, and the aircraft didn't make its first flight until September. After conducting just 2 flights, the Irish Swoop was crated up and shipped to Germany, hastily reassembled, and then flown to the UK, with a stop in Amsterdam because of a cracked cowling. Arriving at the start point just days before the beginning of the race, the organisers were apparently alarmed by the fact that it was a brand new aircraft of basically untested design and that it had experienced issues just in the flight from Germany to England. So they effectively disqualified it from competing by ruling that it was only allowed to carry a limited fuel load over concerns that the untried aircraft was too heavy to be satisfactorily safe. They may have been right to be concerned, as Fitz Morris, determined to get something out of the trip, decided to see if he could set a new airspeed record between London and Baghdad, only having to abort the attempt over Belgium when the aircraft developed problems. In 1935, the aircraft was shipped back to the US to finish its trials, but was damaged in an accident. It was then decided to rebuild it to an improved standard, the 2890, by changing the engine to a more powerful twin Wasp that produced 900 horsepower. In 1936, this aircraft was sold to another famed air racer and record setter, Jim Mollison, who had been the first pilot to fly the Atlantic solo from east to west. In October 1936, Mollison set a new transatlantic speed record when he flew the Bellanca, which he had named Dorothy after his girlfriend, on the first ever New York to London flight. In 1937, he set out to try and set a new record between London and Cape Town, but this failed just short of its destination. Mollison then returned to Europe and in 1937 sold Dorothy to the Spanish Republican government. In July 1936, a bitter civil war had broken out in Spain between the left-leaning Republicans and the right-leaning nationalist parts of the population, with both sides soon acquiring military support from other countries that shared their broader political beliefs. Quite famously, the nationalists were to enjoy considerable support from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, with both of these countries quickly deploying dedicated military volunteer forces to assist the nationalists, most notably in the air. This left the Republicans at a severe disadvantage, and though they would start to get some aircraft from foreign supporters, quite often they had to pay for the equipment supplied. So the offer to buy the 2890 was snapped up, and the Dorothy soon found herself in use as a fast reconnaissance aircraft, reportedly being lost on one such mission, though no one really seems to know for sure what happened to the aircraft. However, even before that, Bellanca's fast aeroplane had caught the eye of the Republicans. In late 1936, even before the original aircraft was sold to them, the Republican Spanish had thought that the Bellanca 2890 might make a useful combat machine. Bellanca certainly saw an opportunity and created the 2890B Flash, a dedicated attack variant of the aircraft for potential military sales. This used the same tandem seat layout as the original 2890, but added the option of fitting bomb racks under the wings. The Flash's other armament is a bit more awkward to detail. Some sources state that the aircraft had a single 30 caliber machine gun fixed for the pilot to use, while the observer in the rear of the cockpit had a pintle-mounted gun of the same type. But while pictures certainly exist of the rear-mounted weapon, I haven't been able to definitely find out if the aircraft did have a forward fixed gun. The documents from Bellanca I have been able to find do state that the rear gun was something of a lash-up, as were the bomb release catches, but I haven't been able to confirm that there was another machine gun fitted. And certainly, as will become apparent as I carry on, it couldn't have been fitted at Bellanca, but would have had to been fitted by the customers. Regardless, the aircraft was fast for the day, with a top sighted speed of 280 miles per hour, and the Republicans ordered 20, and immediately hit a problem. In 1935, the United States had passed the Neutrality Act that prevented the supply of war material to combatants. To try and get around this, the order was disguised as being mail planes for Air France, to the extent that markings and paint was applied to the aircraft to represent the airline. Unfortunately, the American authorities caught wind of the sale and put it under embargo, meaning the first attempt by the Spanish to acquire 2890s had to be abandoned. All was not lost for Bellanca, however, because they found a ready and willing new buyer in the Republic of China. The Chinese were also in desperate need of aircraft, fighting a war against Japan, and had proven a useful source of exports of even the most modern American combat aircraft since 1931. Apparently, the Neutrality Act didn't apply to China, and the 2890Bs were shipped off to join the Republic of China's Air Force in 1937. Here they were equipped for their combat roles, but all were destroyed in short order, either by enemy action or crashes, and practically nothing of their usage in Asia has been recorded. The Spanish, however, still seemed determined to get their hands on more Bellancas, especially after their experiences with the Dorothy, and a second attempt was made to acquire more. Another 22 2890Bs were ordered, along with 3 Boeing 247s, under the guise of equipping a pilot training school in Greece. However, the US was once again wise to the trick, and so another purchaser bought the order, supposedly for supply to Mexico. In fact, the Mexican government was sympathetic to the Republican cause and intended to send these aircraft to Spain to help the war effort. Unfortunately, by the time this was all sorted out, it was 1939 and the Spanish Civil War was over and the Republicans had lost. The new nationalist government of Spain demanded that materials ordered by their vanquished foes, including aircraft and parts, be delivered to them, but as the US had no interest in supplying arms to the nationalists either, the whole batch was sold off to Mexico instead. Depending on your source, it is possible that the Mexicans were effectively given them, but regardless, the Bellancas were shipped to Mexico and then put into service with their Air Force. Here they very quickly acquired an unfortunate reputation after a number of fatal crashes and soon ended up grounded. In 1942, it appears that the US purchased back all of the engines and propellers that had been part of the Spanish order for their own wartime needs, while the remaining airframes were bought by a private trader and then sold on to the US Navy for use as instructional aids at their training schools. That pretty much concludes the operational history of the Bellanca 28 series, but there is one final footnote that is worth going over. As said, the exact armament of the aircraft operated is a bit obscure, and it certainly seems that because of the murky circumstances of the aircraft's usage, armament fits were probably rather ad hoc, being fitted by the users and not at Bellanca's factory, a necessary ruse to get around the Neutrality Act. Bellanca recognised that this was hardly ideal, and so proposed a dedicated, purpose-built military variant, the Bellanca 28-110. Now, as said, this seems to have been a proposal only, because the only evidence for it is in some archival documentation. But it does seem that Bellanca finally got serious about military possibilities and not just building a lashed-up conversion of a racing aircraft. The 28-110 was again given a more powerful engine, the Pratt & Whitney 1830 S3CG-3 Twin Wasp, which could put out a maximum of 1,100 horsepower at combat rating and had a standard output of 950 horsepower. Armament was a proper purpose-built flexible mounting for the machine gun for the observer in the rear, while fixed armament was 4 30 caliber guns, with 2 synchronized to fire through the propeller and another 2 mounted in the wings. The bomb load was 4 300-pound bombs mounted in an internal bomb bay, while 4 102-pound bombs could be carried under the wings, giving a theoretical maximum weapon load of 1,608 pounds. According to Bellanca, the 28-110 had a top speed, presumably projected, of 290 miles per hour with full load, which I'm going to say seems rather optimistic. However, Bellanca did make a spirited attempt, it seems, to sell the aircraft to the Australians at least. Newspapers in May 1939 recalled that Bellanca offered an aircraft to meet a requirement for a new aircraft for the RAAF that was single-engined, carried 5 machine guns, and, interestingly, had a top speed of 200 miles per hour. Price was £12,000 per aircraft, and Bellanca said they could deliver 10 aircraft within 75 days of the order being placed, with 1 per day being delivered thereafter. Now, I don't know for sure that this was the Bellanca 28-110, but given the description and timing, it certainly seems to be the most likely candidate. Unfortunately for Bellanca, the Australians decided that a Lockheed design, assumably the Hudson, was better for their requirements, even though it apparently cost twice as much as the Bellanca. And that was the end of this rather interesting machine, a design that broke records and apparently saw combat usage as well as generated a fair amount of interest, but on which today very little information exists. Considering that the late 1930s saw buyers rushing to purchase as many American aircraft as they could, it is a little surprising that the 2890 and 110 didn't get picked up more, especially as Bellanca claimed to have the ability to churn them out in numbers at short order, as evidenced by their Australian pitch. I mean, the Bellanca would have been obsolete at the start of the Second World War, though that wouldn't have been recognised until combat began, as happened with many other contemporary aircraft types that got production orders at the time. But that wasn't to be for the 28s, and the series disappeared into obscurity, a rather interesting episode in the life of an important but also little known aircraft designer. If you want to know more about the 28 series or else some of the other subjects I've breezed over today, you can find links to a couple of good articles at the Latin American Aviation Historical Society's website and to the Military Matters website in the description. Cheers, everyone. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and all that jazz. Have a good one, and catch you all in the next video.